A clash in the shadows. The late evening air in Rosefield was crisp, heavy with the scent of damp pavement, as streetlights buzzed faintly in the stillness. Chief Naomi Carter, clad in plain clothes and carrying the weight of authority with quiet dignity, stepped out of her unmarked sedan in the precinct parking lot. Her day had been long, filled with endless meetings and decisions, but the satisfaction of making progress toward change kept her grounded. As she locked the car and adjusted her leather jacket, the sharp, cutting voice of Officer Daniel Reed pierced the air. "Step out of the car now." His tone was hostile, and Naomi's sharp instincts immediately bristled. Naomi turned, her calm eyes meeting the source of the aggression. Officer Reed stood there, his hand hovering dangerously close to his holster. His face, shadowed under the flickering glow of the streetlight, was taut with a mixture of misplaced authority and unmasked disdain. "I'm authorized to be here," Naomi replied, her voice steady and even. Her measured tone seemed to have the opposite effect, igniting Reed's temper further. "Don't argue with me. Step back, or I'll make you." He spat, his hostility radiating into the cold air. Naomi raised her hand slightly, her gesture deliberate and calm. "You don't want to do this," she said firmly. "Let's take a step back and—" Before she could finish, Reed's aggression boiled over. His movement was abrupt and forceful as he grabbed Naomi by the arm and shoved her against the car. The impact left her momentarily breathless, but she quickly recovered, her composure unbroken. "People like you don't belong here," Reed hissed, his words laced with venom. Naomi's breath hitched, not from the physical shove, but from the weight of those words. They were familiar, cutting deeper than any physical wound. Straightening herself, she brushed the dust from her jacket and fixed Reed with a gaze that was cold and unyielding. "What did you just say?" she asked, her voice low but sharp, each word slicing through the tension like a blade. Reed sneered, oblivious to the tidal wave about to crash over him. "I said you don't belong here. Now leave, before I call backup." For a moment, the parking lot was silent, save for the distant hum of traffic. Then Naomi's hand reached into her pocket. Slowly and deliberately, she pulled out her badge. The gold emblem glinted under the dim light as she held it up. "Chief of Police," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a thunderclap. Reed's face drained of color as realization set in. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The bravado that had fueled his arrogance only moments ago crumbled into stunned disbelief. "You answer to me," Naomi continued, stepping closer. Her voice was calm but laced with authority. "Do you even understand what you've just done?" Reed stammered, but his words were incoherent. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, chains he had forged with his own hubris. "This isn't over," Naomi said, her gaze unwavering. "I'll see you in my office first thing in the morning." She left him standing there, his confidence shattered, as she walked into the precinct. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was electric. Word of the altercation in the parking lot spread like wildfire. Officers exchanged nervous glances as Naomi made her way through the halls. She could feel the tension, but her expression betrayed none of her thoughts. Once in her office, she closed the door and sat down, her mind already turning over the next steps. She pulled up Reed's personnel file on her computer, scanning through the complaints and reports that had been conveniently buried over the years. Excessive force, racially charged language, disregard for protocol. The deeper she dug, the more appalled she became. Reed wasn't just a problem. He was a symptom of a much larger issue within the department. Naomi leaned back in her chair, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just about one officer's misconduct. It was about dismantling a culture that allowed people like Reed to thrive unchecked. The next morning, the precinct was buzzing with anticipation. Reed walked in, his posture stiff, his expression guarded. Naomi watched him from her office window before calling him in. As Reed entered, he was met with Naomi's calm yet piercing gaze. She gestured for him to sit but didn't offer any pleasantries. "You know why you're here," Naomi began, her tone even. Reed shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Look, Chief, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Naomi raised a hand, cutting him off. "There's no misunderstanding, Officer Reed. What you did last night wasn't just unprofessional, it was unacceptable. And it's not the first time you've crossed the line." She placed a folder on the desk, sliding it toward him. "These are complaints filed against you over the years. Excessive force, discriminatory remarks, insubordination. Every single one ignored or dismissed. Not anymore." Reed's face darkened as he opened the folder, his eyes scanning the damning evidence. "I have no tolerance for this behavior," Naomi continued. "As of this moment, you're suspended pending a full investigation. And believe me, Officer Reed, this is just the beginning." Reed's mouth tightened, but he didn't argue. He could see the determination in Naomi's eyes, a determination that left no room for negotiation. Later that day, Naomi convened a meeting with the department's senior officers. She laid out her vision for a culture shift within the precinct, emphasizing accountability, integrity, and community trust. Some officers nodded in agreement, while others exchanged skeptical glances. "This department has a choice," Naomi said, her voice firm. "We can continue down a path that erodes public trust, or we can rebuild it. But let me be clear, accountability is not optional. If you wear this badge, you will uphold its values." Her words resonated with some, but she knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. Reed's suspension was only the first step in a battle that would challenge everything the department had come to accept as normal. As the meeting ended, Naomi felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve. She glanced out the window of the conference room, the city skyline visible in the distance. This was her city, her department, and she was ready to fight for it. Little did she know, the confrontation with Reed was just the spark that would ignite a firestorm of change, one that would test her leadership, her resilience, and her unyielding commitment to justice. The battle within. The hum of the city outside the precinct windows grew louder as the days passed, a steady pulse that echoed the turmoil brewing inside. Naomi Carter had always prided herself on her calm demeanor, on her ability to remain composed even in the most trying of circumstances. But as she sat at her desk in the aftermath of Officer Reed's confrontation, a storm of thoughts raged in her mind. The decision to suspend Reed had been swift, but Naomi knew the repercussions would be far-reaching. Word of his suspension had spread quickly through the department, and whispers filled the hallways. Some officers supported Naomi's decision, others viewed it as an overreaction, and many remained silent, uncertain about where to stand. Naomi's leadership was being tested in ways she hadn't anticipated. In the days that followed, the weight of that decision began to settle in. The department was divided. The lingering tension was palpable as Naomi walked through the precinct, the eyes of the officers on her as she passed. There was one thing Naomi had learned early in her career. The system didn't change overnight. It was an entrenched machine, one that had worked the same way for years. And Naomi wasn't naive enough to believe that dismantling that machine would come without resistance. Her position as the first black female chief of police in Rosefield wasn't just a personal achievement. It was symbolic, a beacon for all the people who had been told they didn't belong. But it was also a target, a challenge to those who had held power for too long. Naomi's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at her office door. "Come in," she called, her voice steady. The door creaked open, and Officer Tina Marshall, one of Naomi's most trusted allies, stepped inside. Tina had been Naomi's friend long before they were colleagues, and her loyalty was unwavering. She was the type of officer who had always put the community first, a sharp contrast to the type of policing Naomi was trying to root out. "Chief, there's something you need to see," Tina said, her voice tense. Naomi looked up, a frown creasing her brow. "What is it?" Tina held up a phone, and Naomi could see the headlines flashing on the screen. "Reed's supporters are starting a smear campaign," Tina explained, scrolling through the news articles and social media posts. "They're trying to paint you as an overzealous, divisive leader. They're saying you're tearing apart the department." Naomi leaned back in her chair, the weight of the accusation hanging heavily in the air. She had expected this. The smear campaign wasn't a surprise. It was a tactic that had been used time and time again by those desperate to cling to their power. But seeing the articles and posts, filled with vitriol and misrepresentation, still stung. "They'll try to undermine you," Tina said, her voice softer now. "But don't let it get to you. You're doing the right thing." Naomi nodded, but her mind was already racing. The smear campaign was just one front in a larger war. This wasn't just about Reed. It was about the culture within the department, about the entrenched power structures that had allowed officers like him to thrive. It was a war she was determined to win, but it wasn't going to be easy. "I know," Naomi replied, her voice firm. "But I won't let them distract me. We have to stay focused on the bigger picture." The following week, the department convened for a routine meeting. Naomi entered the conference room, her posture straight, her expression unwavering. As she stepped up to the front of the room, the officers who were present fell silent, their eyes trained on her. Naomi cleared her throat and began. "I know there are concerns about the changes we're making here at Rosefield PD. I know there are those who feel threatened by the direction we're heading. But I want to be clear about something. Change is never easy. It's uncomfortable, it's difficult, and it's often met with resistance. But it is necessary." She paused, letting her words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "I did not come into this position to make friends. I didn't come here to be popular. I came here to lead. To ensure that every person in this department and every citizen in this city is treated with fairness, dignity, and respect." The room was still. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward, intrigued by Naomi's words. She could feel the tension, the undercurrent of opposition, but she wasn't backing down. "This department will not tolerate racism, excessive force, or any form of misconduct. If you think this is just a phase, or that I'm just trying to make a statement, think again. We are building something better here. And if you're not with us, then you're against us." Naomi's gaze swept the room, making eye contact with each officer in turn. The silence stretched on, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Naomi could see the wheels turning in the minds of the officers, some starting to question their loyalty to the old guard, others realizing that they were part of a larger shift. It was the beginning of something big, a movement that would take time, but one that was necessary for the survival of the department and for the trust of the community. Outside the department, the pressure was mounting. The press had picked up on the controversy surrounding Reed's suspension, and Naomi was thrust into the spotlight. Journalists called her for statements, asking about the future of the department, about the division within the ranks. Naomi handled each interview with the same poise and determination she had cultivated over the years. She didn't flinch when reporters pressed her, asking if she thought the department was beyond repair, or if she believed the officers would ever come around. She knew better than to offer empty promises. Instead, she focused on the work that needed to be done. "This is about more than just one officer," Naomi said during one particularly heated interview. "This is about creating a culture of accountability, where every officer, no matter their rank or tenure, is held to the highest standards. The Rosefield Police Department has a responsibility to its community, and that responsibility is not negotiable." Back at the precinct, Naomi's leadership was tested again when Reed's supporters began leaking internal documents to the press, framing Naomi's actions as political rather than procedural. The leaks painted her as an outsider trying to destroy the department from within, an image that was all too familiar to Naomi. She had dealt with this kind of hostility before, people in power trying to undermine anyone who threatened their control. But Naomi was undeterred. She knew the truth, and she was prepared to fight for it. In a meeting with her closest allies, she laid out a plan to confront the corruption within the department. There would be no more half measures, no more sweeping things under the rug. The leaks were only the beginning of what would be a larger investigation into the department's practices. "We're not backing down," Naomi declared. "We are going to expose the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it is for some people. The public deserves to know what's really happening here. Her resolve was unwavering, but she knew that the road ahead would not be easy. Her every move would be scrutinized, every decision questioned. But as long as she had the truth on her side, Naomi was ready to take on whatever came next. The battle was just beginning. The whistleblower's revelation. The crisp morning air carried a tense silence across the precinct. Naomi Carter sat at her desk, sipping her coffee while reviewing the latest updates on Officer Daniel Reed's suspension. The department remained in turmoil, divided between those who supported her vision of accountability and those clinging to the old, corrupt ways. Naomi knew she was walking a tightrope, but she also knew that the path forward required unwavering resolve. As she sifted through emails, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. A message from an unknown number. "I have information that could help you. Meet me tonight. Parking garage, level 3. Midnight. Don't bring anyone." Naomi stared at the message, her instincts kicking into overdrive. She'd been in law enforcement long enough to know the risks of meeting an anonymous source. But something about the message felt different. It wasn't a threat. It was a plea. She leaned back in her chair, weighing her options. By the time the sun had set, her decision was made. If this source truly had information that could help her dismantle the toxic culture within the department, it was a risk worth taking. At precisely midnight, Naomi arrived at the nearly deserted parking garage. The air was heavy with the smell of oil and concrete, and the dim overhead lights cast long shadows across the space. She parked her car and stepped out, scanning her surroundings with practiced precision. A figure emerged from the shadows, wearing a hooded jacket and moving cautiously. Naomi's hand hovered near her holstered weapon, just in case. "You're Chief Carter?" the figure asked, their voice low and wary. "That depends on who's asking," Naomi replied, her tone firm but not hostile. The figure hesitated before pulling back the hood, revealing the face of a young officer, barely in his late 20s. Naomi recognized him immediately. Officer James Parker, a relatively new recruit. His nervous eyes darted around, as if expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. "Parker, what are you doing here?" Naomi asked, her suspicion growing. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice trembling. "But if anyone finds out I came to you, my career is over." Naomi crossed her arms. "You're already here. Start talking." Parker took a deep breath, glancing around one last time before speaking. "It's about Reed. And more than just him. There's a network of officers protecting each other, covering up complaints, burying evidence. It's been going on for years, Chief, and it's bigger than you think." Naomi's jaw tightened. She had suspected corruption ran deep, but hearing it confirmed was a different matter. "Go on," she urged. "They call it the Brotherhood," Parker continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not official or anything, but it's a group of senior officers who've got each other's backs. They decide which complaints get investigated and which ones disappear. If you're in, you're protected. If you're out, you're a target." Naomi's stomach churned. "And you're telling me this now because I'm tired of it," Parker said, his voice gaining strength. "I didn't sign up to be part of a gang with badges. I became a cop to help people, but all I've seen is corruption and fear. I've been keeping records, copies of emails, altered reports, everything. I want you to have them." Parker pulled a flash drive from his pocket and handed it to Naomi. She took it, her mind racing. "Why didn't you go through official channels?" she asked. "Official channels are the problem," Parker replied bitterly. "If I reported this, it'd end up on Reed's desk, or someone like him. I'd be out of a job, or worse." Naomi nodded, her respect for Parker growing despite the risk he had taken by staying silent for so long. "This is dangerous, Parker. If they find out you've blown the whistle." "I know," he interrupted, "but I trust you, Chief. You're the only one who can stop them." Naomi slipped the flash drive into her pocket. "You did the right thing coming to me. But from now on, you keep your head down and let me handle this." Parker nodded, relief washing over his face. "Be careful, Chief. These guys don't play fair." Back at her office, Naomi plugged the flash drive into her computer. The files were extensive: emails, scanned documents, internal memos. The evidence painted a damning picture of systematic corruption. Complaints altered to exonerate officers, disciplinary actions erased, and cover-ups of misconduct ranging from minor infractions to serious crimes. Naomi's chest tightened as she scrolled through the files. This wasn't just about Daniel Reed. This was about a network of officers who had manipulated the system to maintain their power and avoid accountability. She paused on a particularly chilling document, an email chain between Reed and several senior officers discussing how to bury a complaint from a civilian who had accused one of them of excessive force. The tone of the emails was casual, almost mocking, as if they were discussing a routine matter. Naomi leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. This was bigger than she had imagined, too big for her to handle alone. She needed allies, people she could trust to help her take this evidence to the right authorities. The first person she called was Officer Tina Marshall. "Chief, it's late," Tina answered, her voice groggy. "This can't wait," Naomi said. "I need you at the precinct. Now." An hour later, Tina sat across from Naomi, her face a mix of shock and anger as she reviewed the files. "This is insane," Tina said, her voice barely concealing her rage. "How long has this been going on?" "Years," Naomi replied. "And it's been protected by people at every level of the department. This isn't just about Reed. It's about a culture that's been allowed to fester." Tina shook her head. "What's the plan?" "We take this to the city council and the state attorney's office," Naomi said. "This isn't something we can handle internally. We need external oversight." "And the Brotherhood?" Tina asked. Naomi's eyes hardened. "We dismantle it, piece by piece." The next morning, Naomi and Tina met with a trusted city council member in the state attorney's office. The evidence was presented, and a task force was quickly assembled to investigate the corruption within the Rosefield Police Department. Word of the investigation spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the department. Officers loyal to the Brotherhood scrambled to cover their tracks, while others, emboldened by the whistleblower's courage, began coming forward with their own stories of corruption and misconduct. Daniel Reed, however, remained defiant. From the safety of his suspension, he began rallying his allies, framing the investigation as a personal vendetta by Naomi. But Naomi wasn't interested in playing Reed's games. She had the truth on her side, and she was determined to see justice served. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Naomi felt a glimmer of hope. The tide was turning, and the cracks in the Brotherhood's foundation were beginning to show. The fight for justice had entered a new phase, and Naomi was ready to lead it. The reckoning. The morning air carried a distinct tension as Naomi Carter stepped into the precinct. Her polished shoes clicked against the tiled floors, echoing the quiet hallway. The precinct wasn't bustling, as it typically would be. An uneasy silence had settled over the building. The task force's investigation into the Brotherhood had begun to ripple through the department, leaving a sense of uncertainty in its wake. Naomi entered her office and closed the door behind her. On her desk lay an overflowing file of evidence, each page a testament to the corruption that had taken root within the Rosefield Police Department. She glanced at her computer screen, where an encrypted email from the state attorney's office awaited her attention. "Chief Carter," the email began, "the task force is prepared to move forward with subpoenas for the implicated officers. We need your approval to proceed." Naomi inhaled deeply, her resolve hardening. She typed a brief response. "Proceed immediately." The reckoning was no longer theoretical. It was here. The subpoenas were served that afternoon. Officers loyal to the Brotherhood were pulled into meetings with task force investigators. Questions were sharp, evidence damning, and their web of lies and manipulation began to unravel. Naomi didn't involve herself in the questioning directly. She trusted the task force to handle the investigations with precision. Instead, she focused on the officers who remained. Some were visibly shaken, their loyalty to the Brotherhood crumbling under the weight of mounting evidence. Others, like Daniel Reed, dug in their heels, defiant and hostile. Reed had returned to the precinct under strict conditions of his suspension. As Naomi passed him in the hallway, his smirk was gone, replaced by a cold glare. "Enjoying this, Chief?" he muttered as she walked by. Naomi stopped and turned to face him. "I don't enjoy cleaning up messes, Reed, but it's necessary." Reed's jaw tightened, his arrogance dimmed but not extinguished. "You think this is over? You think the Brotherhood will just disappear because you say so?" Naomi stepped closer, her gaze piercing. "I don't think it'll be easy, but I know it's the right thing to do. And I don't need your approval for that." Reed's silence spoke volumes as Naomi turned and walked away, her focus unshaken. That evening, Naomi held a department-wide meeting. The precinct's briefing room was packed, the air thick with tension. Officers shifted in their seats, whispering among themselves. Naomi stood at the front of the room, her posture commanding and her expression resolute. "Let's get straight to the point," Naomi began, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "The investigation into corruption within this department is well underway. Some of you may feel angry, betrayed, or uncertain about what's happening. I understand that. Change is difficult, but it's also necessary." She paused, scanning the room. "This investigation isn't about targeting individuals. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that this department upholds the values it claims to represent. If you've done your job with integrity, you have nothing to fear. But if you've abused your power, if you've covered for others who've done wrong, you will be held accountable." The room was silent now, the weight of Naomi's words settling heavily over the officers. "I didn't take this position to maintain the status quo," she continued. "I took it to make a difference. And that's exactly what we're doing. Together, we can rebuild this department into something better. But that requires honesty, accountability, and a commitment to justice." She stepped back, allowing her words to linger. Then, without waiting for applause or approval, she left the room. The weeks that followed were tumultuous. The task force uncovered layers of corruption that extended beyond the precinct, implicating not only officers, but also city officials who had turned a blind eye. The revelation sent shockwaves through Rosefield, dominating headlines and shaking the community's trust in its institutions. Naomi faced a relentless barrage of media scrutiny. Reporters hounded her for comments, twisting her words to fit their narratives. But she remained steadfast, refusing to let the pressure deter her. One evening, as Naomi sat in her office reviewing the latest task force findings, Tina Marshall entered, carrying a folder. "Chief, you need to see this," Tina said, her tone grave. Naomi opened the folder and scanned its contents. Her breath caught as she realized what she was looking at: financial records, falsified reports, and a list of names. At the top of the list was Daniel Reed. "This ties him directly to the Brotherhood's activities," Tina said. "Bribes, intimidation, evidence tampering. It's all here." Naomi closed the folder, her expression unreadable. "This is the final nail in the coffin," she said. "Prepare the formal charges, and make sure this gets to the task force immediately." The next morning, Reed was formally arrested. The precinct watched in stunned silence as he was led out in handcuffs, his once arrogant demeanor replaced by a hollow expression. Naomi stood at her office window, watching as the patrol car carrying him drove away. But even as Reed was taken into custody, Naomi knew the fight wasn't over. The Brotherhood's network extended far beyond him, and dismantling it would require continued vigilance. That evening, Naomi attended a community meeting at a local church. The room was filled with residents, some angry, some hopeful, all eager for answers. Naomi stepped up to the podium, her heart heavy, but her resolve firm. I know this has been a difficult time for all of us, she began. The revelations about the corruption within the department are shocking, and I want you to know that I share your anger and disappointment. But I also want you to know that we are taking action. We are holding those responsible accountable, and we are rebuilding this department from the ground up. A hand shot up in the crowd. How can we trust you? A man asked, his voice filled with skepticism. Naomi met his gaze. You don't have to trust me yet, she said honestly. Trust isn't given, it's earned. And I intend to earn it, not with words, but with actions. I promise you this. I will not stop until this department is worthy of your trust. The room was quiet for a moment, then a ripple of applause began, growing steadily until it filled the space. As Naomi stepped away from the podium, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but she was ready to face them. The reckoning had begun, and Naomi Carter was determined to see it through to the end. The deep roots of corruption. The arrest of Daniel Reed sent shockwaves through the Rosefield Police Department and the city beyond. It was more than a scandal. It was a reckoning. Yet, as Naomi Carter sat in her office late into the night, the weight of her task pressed heavily upon her. She knew Reed was only the beginning. The Brotherhood wasn't just a loose group of officers. It was an entrenched system of corruption with roots reaching far deeper than she had anticipated. Naomi leaned over her desk, sifting through a stack of documents provided by the task force. Each file told a story of betrayal, of officers who had sworn to serve and protect, but instead exploited their positions for personal gain. Bribery, tampering with evidence, coercion, crimes hidden behind badges. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from the state attorney. Tomorrow's press conference is critical. You'll be the face of this department's accountability. Be prepared for resistance. Naomi placed the phone down, her resolve hardening. Resistance was something she was well acquainted with. She was ready. The next morning, Naomi stood behind the podium at City Hall, flanked by members of the task force and city officials. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras clicking and pens scribbling furiously. Naomi adjusted the microphone and began. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Today marks a significant moment for the Rosefield Police Department and for this city. Over the past several weeks, an investigation has uncovered systemic corruption within our department, corruption that has betrayed the trust of the community we are sworn to serve." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Accountability is not optional. Every officer implicated in these investigations will face the consequences of their actions. No one is above the law, and no one will be shielded from justice. A reporter raised his hand. "Chief Carter, do you believe this investigation will repair the community's trust in the police?" Naomi met his gaze. Trust isn't something you fix with a single action or statement. It's something you build, piece by piece, through transparency and accountability. This investigation is just the beginning of that process. Another reporter jumped in. "What do you say to those who claim this investigation is politically motivated?" Naomi's jaw tightened. This isn't about politics. It's about integrity. If holding people accountable for misconduct is seen as political, then perhaps the critics need to reevaluate their understanding of justice. The room fell silent, and Naomi continued, "To the people of Rosefield, I say this. I hear your anger. I see your pain. And I promise you that this department will not rest until it earns back your trust." Later that day, back at the precinct, Naomi called a meeting with her core team. Tina Marshall was there, along with a handful of officers who had proven themselves trustworthy. On the table in front of them were files detailing the Brotherhood's connections to city officials, private contractors, and even local businesses. "This is bigger than just our department," Naomi began, pointing to a flowchart spread across the table. "The Brotherhood's influence extends to nearly every corner of this city. Bribes have been exchanged to protect illegal operations. Evidence has been buried to shield powerful individuals. This isn't just a cleanup. It's a dismantling of a system. One officer, A young man named Officer Malik Torres raised his hand hesitantly. "Chief, with all due respect, how do we even fight something this big? They'd been operating like this for decades." Naomi looked at him, her expression firm but encouraging. "One piece at a time, Torres. Every corrupt officer, every compromised official, every hidden deal. We expose them all. It won't happen overnight, but it will happen." Tina nodded. "And we start with the records room." Naomi glanced at her. "Explain." Tina pulled out a folder. "The Brotherhood has been careful, but they're not perfect. There are inconsistencies in the records, altered incident reports, missing disciplinary files. If we can trace these back to their source, we can uncover who's been protecting them." Naomi nodded. "Do it. And make sure everything you find is backed up. We can't afford to lose any evidence." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Tina and her team pored over records, piecing together the Brotherhood's network. The deeper they dug, the more disturbing the findings became. A prominent real estate developer had paid the Brotherhood to silence complaints from tenants. A city councilman had received campaign contributions in exchange for dismissing allegations of police misconduct. Each revelation brought Naomi closer to understanding the depth of the corruption, but also closer to the danger that came with exposing it. One evening, as Naomi was leaving the precinct, she noticed a black SUV parked across the street. Its windows were tinted, and its engine idled quietly. She ignored it at first, chalking it up to paranoia. But as she drove home, the SUV followed her. Naomi's heart raced, but she kept her composure. She made a series of calculated turns, eventually pulling into a crowded parking lot. The SUV lingered briefly before speeding off. The message was clear. Someone was watching her. The next morning, Naomi called Tina into her office. "We need to be more careful," she said, recounting the previous night's events. "They're getting desperate." Tina frowned. "Do you think they'll escalate?" Naomi nodded. "It's possible. We need to stay vigilant. Make sure everyone on the task force knows to watch their backs." That afternoon, a breakthrough came. Tina's team uncovered an encrypted email server used by the Brotherhood to communicate. With the help of the task force's cybersecurity experts, they cracked the encryption and gained access to a treasure trove of evidence. Emails detailing bribery schemes, blackmail attempts, and coordinated cover-ups. Naomi's eyes widened as she read through the messages. One in particular caught her attention. A plan to sabotage the investigation by targeting the whistleblowers and members of the task force. "We need to act now," Naomi said, her voice urgent. "If they're planning to retaliate, we can't wait for them to make the first move." Tina nodded. "I'll alert the state attorney. This changes everything." The evidence from the email server was the final blow. Arrests were made across the city, corrupt officers, complicit officials, and even prominent business leaders. The Brotherhood's network, once thought to be untouchable, crumbled under the weight of its own crimes. But Naomi knew the fight wasn't over. The roots of corruption ran deep, and rebuilding the department's integrity would take years. That night, as she sat in her office, reviewing the day's developments, Naomi allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, she felt a sense of hope. The reckoning wasn't just about justice, it was about creating a new foundation for the Rosefield Police Department, one built on trust, accountability, and a commitment to serve the people. And Naomi Carter was determined to see it through. The dawn of change. The morning after the final arrests, the Rosefield Police Department was eerily quiet. For months, it had been a battleground of tension, resistance, and revelations. Now it felt like the calm after a storm, but Naomi Carter knew better. This was no conclusion. This was the beginning of a long, arduous journey toward rebuilding. Naomi sat at her desk, staring at the sprawling whiteboard that had become the nerve center of the investigation. Names, photos, and connections were all mapped out, a visual testament to the complexity of the Brotherhood's corruption. Now, most of those names were crossed out, their fates sealed by the evidence amassed against them. A knock at the door pulled Naomi from her thoughts. Tina Marshall stepped in, her face a mix of exhaustion and quiet triumph. "Chief," she began, "the state attorney's office just confirmed it. Formal charges are being filed against everyone we named in the task force's report. They're calling it one of the biggest corruption crackdowns in the state's history." Naomi nodded, her expression unreadable. "Good, but that's just the start." Tina frowned. "You don't seem relieved." Naomi sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I am. But cleaning house is only part of the battle. We've torn down the old structure. Now we have to build something better in its place." Later that day, Naomi called a department-wide meeting. Every officer who remained, those who had not been implicated or had come forward to assist the investigation, was present. The briefing room buzzed with low murmurs as officers filed in, their faces a mix of uncertainty and hope. Naomi stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding. When the last officer took their seat, she began. "What we've been through these past months has been one of the most challenging periods in this department's history," she said. "We've uncovered corruption, betrayal, and a complete disregard for the oath we all swore to uphold. And while the worst offenders have been removed, we are far from finished." The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. "This department has been given a second chance," Naomi continued. "But a second chance means nothing if we don't seize it. It's time to rebuild, not just the policies and procedures, but the trust of this community. That starts with each and every one of you." She paused, letting her words sink in. "We're implementing mandatory retraining for every officer. This isn't a punishment, it's a fresh start. New de-escalation tactics, bias training, and community outreach programs will become the cornerstone of this department. If you think you can't or won't adapt, I suggest you turn in your badge now." A murmur rippled through the room, but no one moved. "Let me be clear," Naomi said, her voice firm. "We are not going back to the way things were. This is a new era for the Rosefield Police Department. And together, we will make it one this city can be proud of." The first few weeks of retraining were met with mixed reactions. Some officers embraced the changes, eager to leave the past behind and build a better future. Others resisted, their skepticism evident in their half-hearted participation. Naomi made it clear that resistance would not be tolerated. One morning, as Naomi walked through the training facility, she stopped to observe a de-escalation exercise. Officers were paired with actors simulating volatile situations. She watched as Officer Malik Torres, the young recruit who had once expressed doubt, skillfully talked down an irate civilian without resorting to force. When the exercise ended, Naomi approached him. "Good work, Torres," she said. He smiled, a bit sheepishly. "Thanks, Chief. I wasn't sure about all this at first, but it's starting to make sense." Naomi nodded. "Keep at it. You're exactly the kind of officer this department needs." Meanwhile, Naomi worked tirelessly to rebuild the community's trust. She organized town hall meetings, inviting residents to voice their concerns and share their experiences with the police. The meetings were often tense, with anger and frustration boiling over, but Naomi welcomed the honesty. At one such meeting, an elderly woman stood up, her voice trembling with emotion. "My grandson was harassed by one of your officers for years," she said. "He's scared of you all. Why should we believe anything will change?" Naomi stepped forward, her expression somber. "Ma'am, I can't erase what's happened in the past, and I won't ask you to trust us blindly. All I can promise is that we are working every day to be better. We want to earn your trust, not through words, but through actions. Please, give us the chance to prove it." The woman sat down, her skepticism unchanged, but Naomi knew that rebuilding trust would take time. As the months passed, the changes began to take root. Community engagement programs brought officers into schools, neighborhoods, and local businesses, not as enforcers, but as allies. Complaints of misconduct dropped sharply, and public perception of the department slowly improved. Naomi received an unexpected visit one afternoon from Officer James Parker, the whistleblower whose bravery had helped expose the Brotherhood. He looked more confident than the last time they had spoken, though a trace of nervousness lingered in his eyes. "Chief, I just wanted to say thank you," he began, "for listening, for taking action. I wasn't sure if coming forward would make a difference, but it feels like it has." Naomi smiled. "It did, Parker. You helped start this change. Never forget that." Months later, during a ceremony to honor officers who had exemplified the department's new values, Naomi stood at the podium, looking out at the audience. Among them were officers who had once doubted her, community members who had once distrusted the police, and the task force members who had worked tirelessly to bring about justice. "This journey hasn't been easy," Naomi said, her voice steady. "But change never is. What we've accomplished here is a testament to what's possible when we refuse to accept the status quo. This is just the beginning. Together, we will continue to build a department and a city that we can all be proud of." As the room erupted in applause, Naomi felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced in years. The fight was far from over, but the foundation had been laid. Rosefield was no longer the same city, and Naomi Carter was no longer just its chief of police. She was its architect of change.